Hey, I'm Org, and in this video I'm going to review the Japanese Tier 6 carrier, the Ryujo. This is a decent aircraft carrier, but it didn't really feel like one since it comes between the Ryujo and the Ryujo, which are two really awesome Japanese carriers. Historically speaking, the Ryujo was actually one of Japan's first aircraft carriers. It was designed in the late 1920s to circumvent the rules of the Washington Treaty on Limiting Naval Armaments. This treaty limited the tonnage of ships that signatory countries could have. Japan was limited to 60% of the tonnage of the US Navy or the UK Navy. Specifically for aircraft carriers, Japan was allowed 81,000 tons worth of displacement. In the 1920s, Japan had 3 carriers. The Hosho was classified as an experimental ship, so didn't count, but the Akagi and Kaga had a displacement of around 37,000 tons each, which didn't leave a lot of tonnage for more aircraft carriers. But there was a loophole. Article 20, Part 4 of the treaty defined an aircraft carrier as a ship of greater than 10,000 tons displacement. Therefore, Japan or any other country could build as many carriers as it wanted so long as they were all below this weight. Which is where the Ryujo comes in. It was designed to pack as much capability into as light a hull as possible. Specifically, the design target was 8,000 tons, only slightly more than the Hosho and less than a quarter of the displacement of the Japanese fleet carriers. However, the Ryujo was designed to have the same speed as the Kaga with half the number of aircraft. Surprisingly, the Japanese designers actually managed this, although it wasn't without consequences. The most noticeable design decision was to include a 2-decked hangar below the flight deck. This allowed a lot of aircraft to be stored in a relatively small hull, but it also made the ship incredibly top-heavy, which, as you can imagine, is a bit risky in heavy seas. The designers also left the ship with almost no armour, which made it very vulnerable when under attack. The Ryujo was laid down in 1929, however in 1930 the London Treaty closed the loophole it was built under, so the Ryujo was the only ship in this class. The ship first went to sea in 1933, however it was back in port to be redesigned in 1934. There were serious concerns about the stability of Japanese ships, and the Ryujo was particularly unstable, as you could imagine. The hull was redesigned and more ballast was added to make it more seaworthy, which is very lucky since Ryujo was caught up in the 4th Fleet incident, which is basically when the 4th Fleet of the Japanese Navy sailed into a typhoon. The Ryujo was damaged along with a lot of other ships and went through extensive repairs and further modifications, which brought its displacement up to a more reasonable 10,600 tons. But to take a while, the Ryujo returned to service in 1936, where it participated in the Second Sino-Japanese War, alongside the Hosho, notably in the bombing of Shanghai, which killed thousands of civilians. The Ryujo's aircraft generally performed well. They had a pretty good record against Chinese fighter planes, but like I say, their bombers were mostly bombing civilian targets for the duration of the war, so it's not really an honourable thing for them to have been doing. In the Second World War, the Ryujo actually played kind of an important role. Its aircraft supported the initial landings in the Philippines before it moved on to support Japanese troops in Malaya, particularly sunk a number of ships that were trying to evacuate Singapore in early 1942. In the naval battles in Indonesia, its aircraft also participated, although its only contribution was to finish off a couple of destroyers that had been abandoned by the Dutch or Australian, I think it were, crews. Ryujo then sailed on to the Bay of Bengal as part of the Indian Ocean raid, where it destroyed a number of merchant vessels, including with its secondary armament. Well, it was firing along with its escort ships, but still, it's not often an aircraft carrier fires its surface ships with its guns. So yeah, the Ryujo actually managed to play a role in most of the early successes in the Japanese Navy, although it wasn't present for Pearl Harbor or the Battle of the Coral Sea, although that's a bit ambiguous whether it was a success or not. Ryujo also missed out on the Battle of Midway. Instead it was actually up north covering the invasion of the Aleutian Islands. The next assignment of the Ryujo would be its last. It took part in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, which was a Japanese attempt to seriously damage the American airbase on Guadalcanal, and basically while covering a landing of Japanese reinforcements to drive the Americans off the island. Ryujo, along with a few destroyers and a cruiser, I say a few, 2 destroyers and a cruiser, was sent on ahead of the other Japanese carriers to launch a strike on Guadalcanal while the other carriers were looking for the American fleet. However, it had been spotted by US area aircraft early on. The Americans actually delayed their attack on Ryujo for quite some time while they were looking for the other Japanese aircraft carriers that they knew were in the region, but later decided that the day was passing, they should just take the one aircraft carrier they could see and try and do what they could there. At the time, the Ryujo had launched an attack on Guadalcanal, and it actually had a number of fighters remaining on the ship. But for some reason, the Ryujo's flight officers decided not to actually put those aircraft on combat air patrol, and only launched them just before the American bombers arrived, so they didn't get up in the air in time to disrupt the American attack. And then the thin armour of the Ryujo proved utterly insufficient as bombs set the fuel tank of the ship on fire. It was described by witnesses on other ships being by as being looking like a stove with just flames pouring out of it. Explosions spread throughout the ship, and she sunk sometime after. So the Ryujo was only involved in the Second World War for a relatively short time, but it still did prove its worth in a variety of battles despite being designed as an extremely light carrier. In game, the Ryujo sits at tier 6, and I found it to be a bit lackluster compared to the Zuiho before it and the Hiryu after it. Coming from the Zuiho, the first thing you'll notice is that you have more aircraft. The Ryujo gets 48 aircraft, which is a significant increase from the 30 on the Zuiho. You will also get 1 more squadron to use. However, the aircraft themselves aren't improved. Other than the dive bombers, they are the same aircraft you had at tier 5. Otherwise, you probably won't notice a lot of difference moving up the tiers. The Ryujo is slightly more agile and has more hit points, AA guns, secondary guns, but not really significantly so. It's mainly the aircraft, or the increasing number of aircraft, that's the big difference for this ship. For this tier, the aircraft of the Ryujo are actually poor. The Independence gets better aircraft across the board. For example, the Ryujo's A6N2 fighters are slower than the Independence's F6Fs. They also do less damage and have low resilience. The low resilience of your aircraft is particularly troubling, as at this tier there is a lot of AA fire, at least compared to tier 5, and your aircraft reserves are not large enough that you can afford heavy losses. Defensively, the Ryujo is excellent. It has 12 127mm guns, which with luck can damage enemy destroyers. These guns are dual purpose and provide you long range AA fire. When fully upgraded with the top hull, these are backed up by 38 25mm AA guns, which are your medium range defence. And between these two types of guns, the Ryujo can devastate attacking enemy aircraft. You saw it just a moment ago if you were watching the video, when a bunch of enemy squadrons flew straight over me and basically put me up to 17 kills. So yeah, and also one thing to note is that one failed strike at this tier can ruin your opponent's game. As to say, losing 17 aircraft at once, even if you've got 48 in reserve, that's a pretty significant loss. When your defences fail, the Ryujo is actually fairly agile. Its rate of shift time of 13.4 seconds isn't bad for an aircraft, and its aircraft carrier, and its turning radius of 770 metres is actually fairly good. Between the two of them, you won't have much difficulty dodging torpedoes. The Ryujo is a bit on the slow side, however, only 29 knots, which makes running away from destroyers a little bit difficult. Your last line of defence is your hit points. You have no armour, but 39,600 hit points isn't bad. It will delay your death for a time. Now onto my strategy when playing in this ship. First off, I'll actually say that I wasn't the greatest in the Ryujo. My win rate after 74 games was only 54%, with on average just under 50,000 damage, 12.5 aircraft kills and 0.75 ships sunk per game. That's actually the lowest ship kill rate of any ship I've played, so feel free to disagree with my strategy on playing this ship. I actually played it much like the Zuiho and the Hosho. I actually also gotta say first, this game I'm playing now. It's a very old one. It's before the Ryujo. A couple of patches ago, all the aircraft carriers had their aircraft shifted, and Japan got new manual attacks, and all sorts of changes happened. And this game's actually from before then, so you won't see me doing much. The basics are still there, but some of the specific tactics I talk about aren't actually happening in this game. So, kind of a case of do what I say, not what I do, but whatever. Anyway, I played the ship much like the Zuiho and the Hosho. I've mostly used the 1-2-2 aircraft loadout. That's 1 fighter, 2 torpedo bombers, 2 dive bombers. Those extra dive bombers can add up to a bit of damage if used correctly. I also used captain skills and modifications to increase the potential of my AA guns. Unsurprisingly, I found the games that I did best in were those where the enemy carrier captain decided to try and prioritise me, because as I said, it's quite easy to dodge torpedoes in the ship and your AA guns are quite deadly. Because of this, I would actually play my Ryujo aggressively. I would try to be spotted early on in the match to try and bait the enemy carriers into attacking me, and in between the AA fire and agility you can be confident that you survive at least one attack and do a fair bit of damage to your opponent's aircraft. You saw it in this game when I went basically towards the central channel. It didn't actually attack me. I think that squadron that flew over me was actually flying to a ship behind me, but I still got a few aircraft kills out of it. You should also note that it actually works in reverse for you. Your aircraft are fragile, and enemy carriers at this tier have decent AA. It's possible for you to destroy a carrier in a single strike. You saw me almost do it at the start of the game, but it will require a bit of luck and a lot of time under enemy AA and fighter fire while waiting for them to use their repair ability. As I kind of saw there, the only reason that carrier got killed was because one of my allies finished it off for me. Against ships, I still favour an automatic cross attack as my go-to method of torpedo launcher. And this attack I would attack with 2 squadrons at the same time from directions roughly 90 degrees apart. This almost guarantees you'll get a few hits, although probably not a lot, and it does mean you're not likely to do a lot of flooding damage. The alternative is to stagger your attacks, which makes your attacks easy to dodge and makes AA fire more dangerous since each squadron will bear the full brunt of it, but can result in more damage, particularly with flooding damage. I almost never did manual attacks in the Ryujo. I very rarely thought it was worth coming in to basically the close range AA fire to drop my torpedoes, and the long range manual torpedo strikes are very difficult to hit with Japanese aircraft carriers. However, this is not true of manual dive bombing attacks, which are very useful. Again, when in the Ryujo, I didn't really use them as much as I should. If you saw me, I basically didn't use them at all in this game. My dive bombers were actually very ineffective in this game. But if I was using manual attacks, especially after the changes that came a patch or 2 after this game, they would have been very effective and very useful. As I said, I generally try and stagger my dive bomber attacks so that one squadron would attack and then the second one, or they'd both attack after the torpedo bombers have been in. Basically, they're just much more reliant on the fire damage than torpedoes are of flooding damage. So you generally want to try and maximise your chance of getting a nice long burning fire on those ships. Basically, manual attacks, all you have to do is get your dive bombers ahead or astern of the enemy ship and then just hold Alt and aim slightly ahead of the ship, and you're basically guaranteed a fire or 2. The ship I fed the most in the Ryujo was the Cleveland. The AA fire on these ships is absolutely absurd, and basically I avoided them as much as I could. You saw earlier, even in Alba, tore up a couple of my squadrons. Against this, it isn't really a ship I enjoyed seeing in-game. I probably bullied low-tier battleships a bit, since they have relatively poor AA guns and manoeuvrability. But of course, if there was a Cleveland nearby, I would kind of be forced to leave them alone. That's really all I have to say about the Ryujo, I think. So let's just talk to the end of this game. There's only a few minutes left. As you can see, it's currently a 5-on-2. I've got my fighters circling above the enemy destroyer, so we're not going to lose track of it. My bombers kind of failed to do any damage to it, and there's no real people on my team in a position to attack it. But I've decided to be very aggressive since I'm pretty confident that we're going to win, and I'm heading through the central channel to engage the enemy aircraft carrier. It's kind of stupid. I've basically come to the conclusion that this aircraft carrier's actually run out of aircraft, but I basically actually just want to get in here and cap the enemy base. Unfortunately, this Ryujo's actually crossed my T, and I've got no forward-firing secondary guns, so it's firing at me, and I can't fire at it. I turn to bring my secondary guns to bear, then realise it is turning into me, so I start swinging the ship the other way to avoid the ram, and I get a couple of secondary hits on it. But we're passing at incredibly short range here, trading point-blank broadsides, but, well, the rear of our ships collide here, and I get a ram kill, which is my only kill of the game, but it's enough to get me the high caliber medal, so nice cheeky way of winning a medal there. You can kind of see my problem with the lack of kills I had in the ship in this game. Like that aircraft carrier early on I did a lot of damage to, but I didn't finish it off. I did a lot of damage to an enemy battleship at one point, didn't finish it off. And this aircraft carrier, well, it was kind of stupid, but I got a kill, and that was my one kill of the game, despite having 9 torpedo hits, 4 bomb hits, 4 fires, 8 floodings, just didn't quite get any of the kills. And that's kind of the Ryujo. As I said, it's not my favourite aircraft carrier in the game, but it's got a lot of the characteristics of a good aircraft carrier. I think it's just its aircraft are quite weak as its big limitation. And other than that, there's nothing really special. I mean, its AA guns are good, but you have to rely on your enemy attacking you to use it. And you've got your extra aircraft, but at this tier with enemy AA fire being as it is, you still tend to lose them pretty quickly. So all in all, Ryujo is just an average ship. It's kind of good training for the Ryu, especially since the Ryu's actually got a lot more aircraft, so that was a lot easier to play with. But yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this video or found it useful or informative, and I'll see you all next time.